Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is your personalized deep dive. And today we're taking this whole stack of expository and theological commentaries you provided on Mark chapter 8, and we're exploring what is honestly a terrifying question.
Terrifying is definitely the right word for it.
Right. Because the question is this: how can you sit mere inches from the creator of the universe and still be utterly, completely blind to reality?
It is a phenomenal question. And looking at the sources you sent us, we're going to see pretty quickly that this isn't, it's not some abstract philosophical puzzle.
No, not at all.
This is a visceral historical event. We are going to unpack one really intense, almost claustrophobic conversation that took place inside a very small fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, it's a story about 13 men, exactly one loaf of bread, and, well, a spiritual disease that can infect absolutely anyone. So the mission of this deep dive is to figure out how proximity to divine revelation does not automatically guarantee spiritual perception.
Right.
You can have all the right data sitting right in front of you. In fact, you can have the very author of that data sitting in your boat and still just completely miss the reality of your situation.
The stakes here really could not be higher. I mean, the detailed theological analyses you provided make it super clear that this narrative is a profound diagnosis of what the authors call spiritual amnesia.
Spiritual amnesia, I like that.
Yeah, it's about the devastating subtleties of how the human heart can, witness absolute miracles, retain the factual data of those miracles in their working memory, and still fail to grasp the glory and the sufficiency of the person standing right in front of them.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really get why this conversation in the boat is so fraught with tension, we can't just jump straight into the dialogue. We need to look at the physical and historical realities of the scene first.
We definitely do.
So set the stage for us based on the historical context. Like, why are they in this boat crossing this specific body of water at this particular moment in time?
Well, to understand the tension, we have to kind of ground ourselves in the geography and the timeline of the Galilean phase of Jesus's public ministry. So we are looking at a period right around AD 29 or 30.
Okay, so right in the thick of it.
Exactly. And the Sea of Galilee is the backdrop here. But in the first century context, that lake is not just a body of water.
Right.
It isn't just a picturesque place for local fishermen to cast their nets. It operates as a highly significant redemptive historical threshold.
Okay, wait, let's break down that term, redemptive historical threshold. You mean it's functioning as like a physical border between two completely different spiritual and cultural worlds?
That is the absolute best way to visualize it. So the Sea of Galilee separates Jewish territory, like the region of Galilee on the western shore, from the predominantly Gentile region known as the Decapolis on the eastern side.
And the Decapolis was a pretty pagan area.
Right. Oh, heavily. It was a federation of 10 Hellenistic cities. The culture there was steeped in Greco-Roman paganism. I mean, they raised pigs there, which made it fundamentally ceremonially unclean territory for an observant Jew.
Wow.
So every single time Jesus and the disciples get into a boat and cross this lake, they're moving between entirely different social, religious, and political jurisdictions.
Like a continuous shifting of boundaries.
Yeah.
That alone has to keep the disciples completely off balance.
Oh, for sure.
They're constantly being forced out of their cultural comfort zones and thrust into the school of Christ, where, the old rules of who gets to experience God's grace are just being completely rewritten.
And if we look at what they have just witnessed before getting into the specific boat, it is honestly staggering. We're talking about back-to-back reality-altering miracles that cross both of those cultural boundaries.
Right. First, they are in a Jewish context.
Yeah. Jesus
has this massive crowd following him, and he feeds 5,000 men. And that number is just the men. It doesn't even include the women and children who were present.
Yeah. It was likely 10 to 15,000 people.
Insane.
Yeah.
And he does this with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Then, shortly after that event, they cross over into a Gentile context, the Decapolis. There, he feeds another massive crowd of 4,000 people, this time starting with 7 loaves.
Think about the logistics of that from the disciples' perspective. They weren't just standing in the back watching Jesus perform a magic trick on a stage.
Right, they were involved.
Highly involved. They were the ones physically handling the food. They felt the weight of the multiplied bread in their own hands. They were walking through the crowds, tearing off pieces of bread that defied the literal laws of physics, handing it to hungry families.
Yeah.
And then they were the ones who had to bend down and collect the massive amounts of leftovers.
So they have undeniable, experiential, tactile evidence of Christ's absolute sovereign dominion over the physical world. I mean, they have literally distributed the evidence with their own hands.
Which is exactly what makes verse 14 so utterly bewildering. The narrative irony is incredibly thick here.
Oh, it's wild.
They get into the boat to cross the lake once again, and Mark, acting as the narrator, drops in this very specific, almost funny historical detail.
They forgot to pack a lunch.
They forgot lunch. The Greek text actually emphasizes this by noting they have hesartos in the boat, one single loaf of bread, for 13 grown men.
And their reaction is immediate panic. They look at the one loaf, they look at the 13 mouths to feed, and they start agonizing over the scarcity. They are terrified of not having enough food. It is so absurd.
It really is.
It's like sitting in the control room of a massive nuclear power plant, right? Panicking and crying because your smartphone battery is at 1%, completely forgetting that the source of all power on the entire eastern seaboard is right next to you, literally humming through the walls.
That analogy perfectly captures the psychological disconnect happening in that boat. They are completely obsessed with their 1% battery, the single loaf of bread. Now, the theological commentaries you provided are very careful to warn us against strict allegory here.
What do you mean by strict allegory?
Well, we shouldn't necessarily say that Mark is trying to write a coded message where the one loaf equals Jesus in a rigid one-to-one allegorical sense.
Right, because it was a literal, physical loaf of bread sitting in a literal wooden boat.
Exactly. But the theological weight of the narrative irony is just impossible to ignore. Even if it isn't strict allegory, the contrast is very intentional.
Yeah.
These men are agonizing over temporal physical bread while sitting shoulder to shoulder with the incarnate Lord, the one who just proved twice that he is the true provider. They are measuring their security and their survival based entirely on what they failed to pack in their earthly bags.
They're looking at the math of their circumstances rather than the identity of the person sitting on the wooden bench across from them. But let's dig into the psychology of this moment. If they are sitting next to the ultimate provider, why are they suddenly so anxious?
That's a great question.
Because a forgotten lunch is annoying, sure, but it doesn't usually cause a full-blown crisis among seasoned fishermen who are, used to missing meals out on the water. There has to be a catalyst for this anxiety.
There is a major catalyst. To fully grasp why the atmosphere in the boat is so tense, we have to back up just a few minutes in the timeline. Just before they pushed off from the shore, Jesus had a highly hostile encounter with the local religious leaders.
Oh, right.
Yeah, in verses 11 through 13 of Mark 8, we see the Pharisees come out and they just begin to argue with him.
And they demand a sign from heaven, which, given what we just discussed, is incredibly audacious.
Beyond audacious.
He has just fed 4,000 people in the Decapolis. He has been healing the sick, casting out demons, and multiplying food. What more of a sign could they possibly demand?
Well, the demand for a sign wasn't an honest request for evidence. The sources point out that this was a malicious, hypocritical test.
Okay, so it was a trap.
Exactly. The Pharisees weren't looking for proof so they could believe. They were looking for a specific type of apocalyptic spectacle that fit their preconceived theological demands, or more likely, they were looking for him to fail so they could discredit him publicly.
And Jesus' reaction to them is visceral. Mark notes that Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit. And that isn't just a sign of physical exhaustion, is it?
No, it implies a profound, agonizing grief over their hardened unbelief. He recognizes that their request is completely disingenuous. It is judicial blindness. So he flatly refuses to play their game.
He just shuts it down.
He does. He says, "Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." He abruptly leaves them standing on the shore, gets into the boat with the disciples, and they just push off into the water.
So the disciples are sitting in this boat, processing this incredibly tense, abrupt departure. Jesus is silent, clearly grieved. They realize they forgot the food. The anxiety starts to really bubble up. And then, in verse 15, Jesus breaks the silence with a very sudden, urgent command. He says, "Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod."
And this is where the Greek syntax becomes literally explosive. The grammatical structure Mark uses here is designed to wake the reader up. Jesus uses an asyndetic construction.
Okay, for those of us who aren't Greek scholars, asyndeton means the writer intentionally removes the conjunctions.
Yeah, right.
There is no and or but linking the verbs together. It's just rapid fire.
That is it, exactly. We have two present active imperatives stacked right on top of each other without any connective tissue. Horit, lapete. It translates literally to see, watch, or take heed, beware. By putting these two commands together like this, Jesus creates an intense rhetorical urgency.
It's not a casual piece of advice. He isn't saying, hey guys, if you have a second, maybe keep an eye out for this.
Not at all. It is a military-grade alert. The present tense means this needs to be a continuous, ongoing state of high alert. He is commanding them to remain constantly, actively on guard against a very specific, highly dangerous threat.
And the threat he names is leaven. Now, to a modern listener, leaven just means yeast. It's what you buy in little packets at the grocery store to make sourdough bread rise. But for a first-century, Second Temple Jewish audience, what does that metaphor actually carry?
Oh, it carries massive theological and historical baggage. Think back to the Exodus and the establishment of the Passover. God commanded the Israelites to eat unleavened bread, and during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they were required to ruthlessly search the homes and purge every single scrap of leaven from their property.
Because leaven represented the old life in Egypt, right?
Yeah.
The corruption they were supposed to be leaving behind.
Yes. In Jewish thought, leaven is almost universally a symbol for pervasive, active, invisible corruption. We have to remember how bread was made back then. You didn't use a sterile packet of dry yeast. You took a small piece of fermented sourdough left over from the last batch you baked, and you kneaded it into the fresh, new batch of flour.
So it was literally rotting, fermented dough being introduced into pure flour.
Precisely. It is a process of decay,
Yeah.
and it only takes a microscopic amount of that sourdough to completely penetrate and alter the cellular structure of the entire new batch. It spreads silently, invisibly, and inevitably.
Wow.
Yeah. Jesus is using this everyday baking process to explain how false doctrine and worldly compromise operate.
They don't announce themselves with an invading army. They don't wave a flag and declare war on your faith.
No, they quietly penetrate the human heart. They seep into a community, and if left unchecked, that tiny compromise ferments and corrupts the entire system from the inside out.
Jesus specifically names two highly contagious strains of this corruption, though. The leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Let's kind of dig into the sources and break these down. Let's start with the Pharisees. What exactly is the Pharisaic leaven?
The commentaries describe the leaven of the Pharisees as the corruption of legalism. It is religious formalism, self-righteousness, and the deadly habit of elevating human tradition to the absolute level of God's word.
So it's the belief that you can manage your own righteousness through external behavior.
Exactly. The Pharisees believed that divine favor was secured by their meticulous outward performance of extra-biblical rules. It is a form of spiritual pride that looks incredibly devout and disciplined on the outside, but as Jesus pointed out in other passages, it leaves the heart completely dead on the inside.
Just a whitewashed tomb.
Right. It's a judicial reprobate blindness that substitutes the appearance of holiness for actual inward transformation.
Okay, so that's the religious extreme. But then Jesus warns about the leaven of Herod. Now, Herod Antipas was the tetrarch of Galilee. He was a political ruler, essentially a client king propped up by the Roman Empire. He was the one who had John the Baptist beheaded. So what does his leaven represent?
The Herodian leaven represents secular compromise. It is political pragmatism, worldly opportunism, sensuality, and the attempt to build security through earthly power and alliances rather than trusting in divine truth.
Okay, so total pragmatism.
Yeah, Herod wasn't concerned with the intricacies of the Torah at all. He was concerned with maintaining his power, pleasing his Roman overlords, and satisfying his own fleshly desires.
Let me push back on this grouping because historically and sociologically, this is a very strange pairing.
It really is.
The Pharisees were fierce Jewish traditionalists who absolutely despised the Roman occupation. Herod was a Hellenized political puppet who represented everything the Pharisees hated. They were bitter, vicious enemies. Why on earth does Jesus group their leaven together in a single breath?
That is the brilliant insight that the theological sources highlight. Ideologically, they were polar opposites, but Jesus sees through the surface-level political and religious differences to the underlying spiritual reality. What unites them is an unholy alliance against Christ himself.
They are united by what they reject.
Precisely. Both factions unite in their mutual rejection of Christ's messianic identity and his call to inward radical repentance.
Because it threatens both of their systems.
Exactly. The Pharisees rejected Jesus because he refused to fit into their legalistic, tradition-bound framework. The Herodians rejected Jesus because his kingdom was not of this world, and his growing popularity threatened their secular political stability.
So whether you're trying to save yourself through extreme religious rule-keeping or trying to save yourself through political maneuvering and worldly power, you end up at the exact same destination, which is autonomous unbelief. You are rejecting the sovereign grace of God in Christ.
And that is why both are a deadly leaven. They both spring from the exact same root of a hardened heart. And what's fascinating about the sources you provided is that they don't just leave this as an interesting historical footnote. They impartially report on how these ancient corruptions are applied by theologians to the modern landscape.
This is where it gets very practical for the listener. We want to be clear here. We are objectively relaying the arguments made by the authors of these specific theological texts, but they make a compelling case that these two forms of leaven are still actively fermenting today.
Absolutely. The sources argue that the Pharisaic leaven is highly visible in modern religious systems that add human merit to the equation of salvation.
Like what?
For example, the authors point to Roman Catholicism, arguing that its emphasis on sacramentalism and human cooperation in justification mirrors the Pharisaic reliance on external rites. But they don't let Protestants off the hook either.
Well, I'm sure they don't.
They argue that Protestant legalism, where grace is theoretically affirmed, but actual church culture demands strict adherence to moralistic checklists and behavioral modification, is the exact same Pharisaic leaven at work.
It's the constant temptation to think that your standing with God is based on how well you perform your religious duties today. But what about the Herodian leaven? How do the sources see secular pragmatism infecting the modern landscape?
The authors argue that Herodian leaven is present anywhere the church seeks relevance, power, or security through worldly means. They explicitly apply this label to modern liberal theology, which attempts to strip away the supernatural elements of Scripture, like the miracles or the bodily resurrection, in order to appease modern scientific sensibilities.
Making it more palatable.
Right. They also point to seeker-sensitive church pragmatism, where the hard truths of the gospel are softened to increase attendance numbers and market appeal.
Because that is fundamentally a political, pragmatic calculation. You are altering the message to secure earthly success, just like Herod altered his loyalties to secure his throne.
Yes. The sources also cite the prosperity gospel, which turns faith into a tool for acquiring earthly wealth and comfort. And they even apply the Herodian label to ideological movements like critical race theory when adopted by the church.
Interesting.
The underlying argument the sources are making is that whenever a doctrine substitutes human sociological strategy, worldly philosophy, or political activism for the sovereign grace of God, it is acting as a Herodian leaven. It is seeking a kingdom of this world.
That is a staggering and, frankly, terrifying diagnosis. It basically covers the entire spectrum of human error. You aren't safe just by avoiding the hyper-religious extreme, because you might fall right into the hyper-secular extreme.
Exactly. It's a trap on both sides.
So Jesus drops this massive worldview-altering theological warning in the middle of this tiny boat. How do the disciples react? Do they ask for clarification on the nuances of these two corruptions?
Their reaction is one of the most embarrassingly mundane moments in the entire New Testament.
So bad.
It really is. Verse 16 tells us exactly what they do. Jesus says, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees," and Herod and the disciples look at each other, they start arguing, and they reach this brilliant conclusion. He's saying this because we have no bread.
It is almost comical. It's as if a CEO pulls their executive team into a highly secure, locked boardroom. The CEO looks terrified and warns them about a massive existential corporate espionage threat that is about to destroy the entire company.
Right.
And the executive team looks at each other and immediately starts arguing because they think the CEO is passive-aggressively mad that they forgot to pick up donuts for the break room on the way to work.
They completely reduce high divine theology to baker's economics. They hear the word leaven, their stomachs grumble, they remember the one loaf, and their minds just instantly short-circuit.
The Greek verb used to describe their argument is really revealing too, isn't it?
Yes, Mark uses the word dialogizomai in the imperfect tense. Dialogizomai means to reason, to debate, or to reckon. Because it is in the imperfect tense, it indicates a continuous, ongoing action in the past.
So they didn't just whisper one comment and move on.
No, they didn't just make a quick mistaken comment. They were actively hashing it out, going back and forth, trying to solve this perceived physical crisis.
It's an ongoing, completely fruitless internal debate. They are looking horizontally at each other, trying to figure out who forgot the lunch and how they are going to survive, instead of looking vertically at Christ, who is sitting right there listening to them panic.
This highlights the psychological danger of what the theological commentaries refer to as carnal-mindedness or practical atheism. This is a concept we really need to unpack because it explains so much of human anxiety.
Okay, yeah, let's define practical atheism. Because it doesn't mean you intellectually deny that God exists. These men clearly believe in God. They know Jesus is the Messiah, or at least a prophet of God. So how are they being atheists?
Practical atheism happens when a believer takes a visible material deficit, a lack of resources, and makes that physical reality the ultimate lens through which they interpret everything, including God's word.
Everything gets filtered through the lack.
Exactly. It could be a lack of finances, a terrifying medical diagnosis, a sudden job loss, or a decline in ministry numbers. Whatever the crisis is, it becomes the dominant reality.
And so when Jesus speaks, they force his spiritual warning through the filter of their physical anxiety.
Yeah.
They are so consumed by the missing bread that when they hear leaven, they can't possibly conceive of a spiritual metaphor. Their physical circumstances become their ultimate reality, and God's word is forced to fit into that tiny, anxious box.
Exactly. When you operate in that state of carnal-mindedness, you are acting as if God does not exist in your present circumstance. Or at the very least, you're acting as if his past faithfulness has zero bearing on your current crisis.
Which is so common.
It is. You calculate what is in your boat, you look at the one loaf, and you decide whether hope is reasonable based purely on earthly math. You just leave the divine out of the equation.
But Jesus does not just sigh, shake his head, and let them continue their ridiculous argument about the donuts. He steps directly into the middle of their panic. And what he does next is fascinating because he completely shifts the focus. He moves from their external physical behavior, arguing about bread, to a terrifying internal diagnosis of their souls.
He unleashes an absolute barrage of intense, rapid-fire questions. Verses 17 and 18 are just a cascade of divine interrogation. He knows exactly what they're whispering about, and he confronts it head-on.
What does he ask them?
He says, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear, and do you not remember?"
8 questions, back to back. It is relentless. He is verbally backing them into a corner. And to a Jewish audience, these aren't just random rhetorical questions, are they? The language he is using is incredibly loaded with historical and prophetic weight.
Highly loaded. The sources point out that Jesus is directly echoing the prophetic indictments from the Old Testament. If you read the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel, you find this exact phrasing used to condemn the apostasy of the nation of Israel.
For example, Jeremiah 5 talks about foolish people who have eyes but see not, and ears but hear not. Ezekiel 12 talks about a rebellious house that has eyes to see but does not see.
Yes. Jesus is taking the grave, severe diagnosis of apostate, rebellious, idolatrous Israel, and he is applying it directly to his own inner circle of disciples.
Wow.
He is telling them that their anxiety over the bread is a symptom of the exact same spiritual blindness that destroyed their ancestors.
That is incredibly heavy. To be told by the Messiah that you are acting like the rebellious house of Israel, and the words he chooses to describe their mental state are very precise. The commentaries draw a sharp distinction between 2 specific Greek words used for understanding in this passage. Can we break those down?
We definitely should. The text uses 2 distinct verbs for cognitive function, noio and synemi. Noio refers to mental apprehension. It is the ability to recognize facts, to gather data, to perceive the basic reality of a situation.
So the disciples possess noeo. They have the raw data. They know they only have one loaf. They know they are in a boat. They know Jesus is there with them.
Correct, but what they lack is the second verb, synemi. Synemi means to put the pieces together. It is the ability to synthesize those raw facts into personal trust, spiritual comprehension, and wisdom.
Okay, so it's the application of the knowledge.
Right. It is connecting the dots between the fact that Jesus fed 5,000 people yesterday and the fact that you are hungry today.
They have the data, but the data is completely inert. It's sitting in their brains, but it isn't moving down into their affections. It isn't changing their hearts or dictating their emotional response to the crisis.
Which brings us to the phrase that must have truly chilled them to the bone. Jesus asks, "Are your hearts hardened?" The sources dive deep into the grammar of that specific phrase, and it reveals something terrifying about how sin operates in the believer's life.
What does the Greek reveal about a hardened heart?
The phrase uses a very specific verb form, the perfect passive participle peperomenon. The root word means to cover with a thick callus, to petrify, or to turn to stone. Think of a laborer who works with their hands every day. Over time, the skin builds up a thick, dead layer of callus so they no longer feel the friction.
They lose their sensitivity.
Exactly. And because this verb is in the perfect tense, it describes a continuous present state that is the direct result of a past, ongoing process of neglect.
So their hearts didn't just suddenly turn to stone
Yeah.
the moment they realized they forgot the lunch.
No, the perfect tense implies that this callus has been building up over time. It is the result of repeatedly witnessing miracles, repeatedly hearing the truth, and repeatedly failing to synthesize that truth into actual resting faith.
So every missed opportunity hardens them a bit more.
Yeah, every time they saw a miracle and said, wow, that's amazing, but didn't allow it to fundamentally change their trust in God, another layer of callus formed on their hearts.
Wait, I have to push back here on behalf of the disciples. Let's look at who we are talking about. These are the 12 apostles. This is Peter, James, and John. These men literally dropped their fishing nets, abandoned their family businesses, left their livelihoods, and risked everything to follow Jesus. How can they have hardened hearts like the Pharisees?
It sounds like a paradox, doesn't it?
It does. Are the sources suggesting that the inner circle of Jesus is in the same spiritual boat as the men who were actively plotting to murder him?
That is a phenomenal question, and it addresses the core tension of the passage. The commentaries make a crucial distinction here. First, we have to acknowledge a hard truth privilege, even apostolic privilege, even physically walking with Jesus, does not grant you automatic immunity from spiritual dullness.
Wow. Proximity to the light does not guarantee that your eyes are open.
Right. So just being in the boat doesn't keep your heart soft. However, there is a massive, eternal difference between the Pharisees' blindness and the disciples' blindness.
What's the difference?
The Pharisees suffer from what theology calls a judicial reprobate blindness. Their hardness is a settled, aggressive hostility. They hate the light, and they want to extinguish it because it exposes their dark, self-righteous deeds.
But the disciples aren't hostile. They're just incredibly slow and anxious.
Exactly. The disciples are experiencing a gracious, corrective blindness. Yes, Jesus' rebuke to them is incredibly severe. It stings. But look at the difference in how he treats them.
Yeah, he doesn't leave him.
Exactly. The Pharisees, he abandoned on the shore. He refused to give them a sign, turned his back, and sailed away. But the disciples, he takes with him into the boat. He doesn't abandon them. Instead, he interrogates them.
It is the discipline of a loving father versus the judgment of a judge.
That is exactly the dynamic. This severe interrogation is an act of persevering grace. Jesus is wounding them in order to heal them. He is exposing their dullness, scraping away at that callus so that they do not settle into a permanent state of unbelief. He refuses to let them stay comfortable in their practical atheism.
He is diagnosing the disease with absolute precision so that he can cure it. Which leads us to the next vital question. How does a believer cure this kind of spiritual amnesia? How do you break up that calcified layer on your heart when you feel the panic setting in? Because Jesus doesn't just diagnose them and leave them to figure it out. He gives them a very specific, highly practical test.
He does. He moves seamlessly from diagnosing the disease to prescribing the cure. And the cure is forcing them to actively, verbally remember the details of redemptive history.
In verses 19 and 20, he essentially plays a game of historical trivia with them, right there in the middle of the lake. He asks, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they are forced to answer out loud, 12. Then he asks, and when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they answer, 7.
This exchange is where the Gospel of Mark proves itself to be an eyewitness account of the highest historical order.
How so?
Well, it destroys the skeptical idea that these stories were just myths invented decades later by a disconnected community. The vocabulary Mark uses for the baskets in the original Greek is astonishingly precise.
Oh, right. The sources really drill down into this detail. Let's get into the basket exegesis because it is fascinating. What is the difference between the baskets used in the 2 miracles?
For the first feeding, the one with the 5,000 in Jewish territory, Mark uses the word kophinos. A kophinos is a specific type of heavy, woven wicker basket. It was the standard luggage for a Jewish traveler in the 1st century.
Why did Jewish travelers need a specific type of heavy basket?
Because of kosher laws. When Jewish people traveled through Gentile areas, they couldn't buy food in the local markets without risking ceremonial defilement. So they carried their own kosher food supplies in these sturdy wicker baskets, the kophinoi.
That makes perfect sense.
So in the Jewish feeding, Jesus uses Jewish kosher baskets to gather the leftovers. And there are exactly 12 of them, heavily symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Wow. He satisfies the nation of Israel, completely filling their traditional baskets. But what about the second feeding, the one in the Gentile Decapolis?
For the miracle with the 4,000, Mark uses an entirely different Greek word for basket, spyris. A spyris is a large, flexible storage hamper, often made of rope or reeds. It was the standard container used in Gentile commerce and trade for moving bulk goods. These things were huge.
How huge are we talking?
Well, to give you a biblical point of reference, the word spyris is the exact same word used in Acts chapter 9 to describe the basket they used to lower the Apostle Paul down the outside of the city wall in Damascus to help him escape.
Wait, really? So it's large enough to hold a grown man?
Exactly. It's a massive Gentile trade hamper. And in this miracle, they collect exactly 7 of them. The number 7 in biblical numerology is often associated with completeness, and specifically the 70 nations of the Gentile world mentioned in Genesis 10.
That is incredible detail. So Mark isn't just padding his word count with different synonyms to make the writing sound varied. He is recording granular, eyewitness historical data to prove a massive theological point.
Yes, he is.
Christ's sovereign power to provide is absolutely boundless. It crosses every geographical border. It transcends every ethnic demographic. He abundantly satisfies the Jewish crowds with 12 kophinoi, and he abundantly satisfies the Gentile crowds with 7 massive spyrides.
Precisely. The grace of God cannot be contained by cultural boundaries, and Jesus forces the disciples to state those numbers 12 and 7 out loud.
Right, but why? Why make them recite the math?
Because biblical memory is not just nostalgia.
It isn't just looking back fondly on the good old days of the ministry.
No, not at all. According to the theological analyses, and here the sources rely on historic Protestant theological frameworks regarding true religious worship, active covenantal remembrance is the God-ordained weapon against worldly anxiety.
Active covenantal remembrance. That sounds a bit dense. It means intentionally, deliberately calling to mind what God has promised in his covenant and what he has already historically accomplished to prove his faithfulness, right?
Exactly. Remembering past grace is the lens through which you must interpret your present duty and your present crisis. When you are staring at one single loaf of bread in your boat and your earthly math is telling you to panic, the only antidote is to actively force your brain to remember the 12 kophinoi and the 7 spyrides.
You have to preach the facts of history to your own anxious soul.
Yes, it silences unbelief. It destroys the carnal mindedness that comes from trusting your own earthly calculations. Jesus is saying, look at your own track record with me. Look at the data you just recited. If I can create food out of nothing to feed 9,000 people across 2 different cultures, do you really think we are going to starve in this boat because you forgot a lunchbox?
That puts it in perspective. So we have this intense, localized lesson about faith and provision. But what does this all mean for the big picture of Mark's gospel? Mark is a brilliant writer, crafting this narrative carefully. Why did he place this exact story of spiritual blindness right here, at this specific moment in the overarching timeline of Jesus' life?
If we zoom out and look at the literary architecture of Mark's gospel, it is truly a masterpiece. We have to look at what happens immediately after they get out of this boat.
Okay, what happens?
In Mark 8, verses 22 through 26, they arrive at a town called Bethsaida. And immediately, Jesus is presented with a blind man to heal.
But this isn't a normal healing, right? Mark records it as a 2-stage miracle. It's actually the only time Jesus heals someone gradually.
Right. Jesus takes the blind man, spits on his eyes, lays his hands on him, and asks, "Do you see anything?" The man looks up and says, "I see men, but they look like trees, walking."
So his vision is restored, but it is blurry, distorted, and out of focus.
Exactly. So Jesus lays his hands on the man's eyes a second time, and the text says his sight was fully restored and he saw everything clearly.
Why would Mark place that specific, unusual miracle immediately after the intense conversation in the boat?
Because the physical miracle is a living, breathing object lesson for the disciples' spiritual condition. Mark is showing us that the disciples are the blind man at Bethsaida.
Oh, that makes so much sense. The disciples have blurry spiritual vision. They see Jesus. They know he is special. They know he can perform miracles. They have the data. But they don't see him clearly yet.
No, they don't.
They are looking to the Messiah, but spiritually speaking, they are seeing trees walking. They don't grasp the full picture of who he is or what he came to do.
And this 2-stage physical healing leads directly into the major turning point of the entire gospel. Right after Bethsaida, they travel to Caesarea Philippi. This is where Jesus asks the ultimate question. Who do you say that I am? And Peter, acting as the spokesman, finally confesses, "You are the Christ."
That is the first stage of clear vision. Peter sees the title.
But immediately after that confession, Jesus predicts his death. He tells them he must suffer, be rejected, and be killed. And how does Peter react?
He takes Jesus aside and actually rebukes him.
Right. Peter sees the crown, but he is completely blind to the necessity of the cross. He wants the conquering king, but he rejects the suffering servant.
Exactly. Peter's spiritual sight is still distorted. He sees trees walking. He requires a further, deeper touch from Christ to fully comprehend the gospel. And our sources draw deeply on redemptive historical theology to explain this dynamic.
They really do.
They note how this entire sequence perfectly illustrates the theological framework which details Christ's role as the mediator. Let's break that framework down for the listener, because viewing Jesus through the lens of his offices, prophet, priest, and king, is a classic, incredibly helpful way to understand his ministry. How is Jesus functioning in those three roles right there inside that little fishing boat?
As prophet, Jesus is the ultimate revealer of truth. He is exposing their hidden sin, interpreting the historical danger of the Pharisees and Herod, and diagnosing the hardness of their hearts with piercing divine authority.
He speaks the truth that cuts through their carnal-mindedness. And as king,
He is the one who exercises absolute sovereign dominion over physical creation. The entire conversation hinges on the fact that he is the king who commands the bread to multiply. He is the Lord of the feast who can sustain his people out of literally nothing.
And finally, how does he act as priest in this moment?
As high priest, he displays astonishing, long-suffering mercy. He severely rebukes their spiritual slowness, yes, but he does not cast them away.
He doesn't give up on them.
Exactly. He doesn't throw them overboard and find better, smarter disciples. He patiently instructs them. He forces them to remember the past. He is actively shepherding them out of their crippling anxiety and interceding for their weak faith.
Which brings us full circle back to that single loaf of bread sitting in the boat. It was a physical loaf of bread, but it pointed to an eternal spiritual reality that they were completely missing. Jesus is the greater Moses.
Explain that connection. How does Moses fit into the boat?
Well, think about the Exodus. Moses led the people into the wilderness, and God provided manna from heaven to keep them from starving. But that manna only sustained temporal physical life for a single day. If you tried to hoard it or save it for tomorrow, it rotted and bred worms.
Right.
There's a temporary fix for a temporary problem. But Christ is the true bread of life. He didn't just come to provide a meal. He came to be the meal. His substitutionary sacrifice on the cross is what secures eternal redemption. The disciples are panicking about a temporary meal, missing the fact that eternal life is sitting right next to them.
That is the absolute crux of the passage. If you have the bread of life, you possess the one who created the wheat, the water, the yeast, and the very concept of sustenance itself.
Earthly math looks at the situation and says, 1 loaf of bread divided by 13 hungry men equals starvation. But heavenly math looks at the exact same situation and says 1 loaf of bread plus the creator of the universe equals infinite overflowing abundance. The source of all ultimate security isn't making sure you have enough literal bread packed in your boat. It is knowing exactly who is in the boat with you.
So Mark brings this intense claustrophobic scene to a close, but the way he ends the narrative in verse 21 is honestly quite chilling.
It really is. Let's look at the final verse. Jesus has just walked them through the math test. 5,000 people, 12 Jewish baskets. 4,000 people, 7 Gentile baskets. He has laid out the undeniable evidence of his power and his provision. And then he asked them one final haunting question. Do you not yet understand?
And then there is nothing but silence.
Silence. There is no answer recorded in the text. Mark doesn't write, and then Peter suddenly understood and they all worshipped him. The narrative just abruptly cuts off. They arrive at the shore and they move on to Bethsaida. Why would Mark end the scene like that? It feels completely unresolved.
The sources argue that this silence is incredibly intentional on Mark's part. By leaving that final question hanging in the air unanswered, Mark prevents the reader from hiding behind the apostles.
What do you mean by hiding behind them?
Well, if Peter had answered, "Oh, I get it now, Lord. You are the bread of life and we don't need to worry," we, the readers, could just smile, nod our heads, feel good about the resolution of the story, and close our Bibles. We would assume the problem was solved.
We'd let ourselves off the hook.
Exactly. But because the question is left unanswered, it creates a tension that refuses to let the reader go.
That unresolved question escapes the boundaries of the first century. It crosses the centuries, it reaches through this deep dive you are listening to right now, and it looks directly at you.
It forces every single person who encounters this text to answer the question for themselves. Jesus is looking at you, the listener, and asking, after all the providence you have experienced in your life, after having the full, completed revelation of the cross, the empty tomb, and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, do you still not understand? Are you still letting your earthly circumstances dictate your view of God's goodness?
Which brings us to our final, provocative thought for you to chew on as we wrap up today's deep dive. We want you to think about your own life right now. When you look at the boat of your career, your family, your health, or your future, and you see scarcity, when the earthly math simply doesn't add up and you feel that familiar panic rising in your chest, what leaven starts fermenting in your mind?
It is the ultimate test of your functional faith. In that moment of panic, do you turn to the pragmatic leaven of Herod? Do you try to fix the problem yourself through worldly compromise, political maneuvering, or sacrificing your convictions just to secure a little bit of earthly stability?
Or do you turn to the leaven of the Pharisees? Do you fall into the trap of thinking you can earn your way out of the crisis through rigid, self-righteous performance, trying to bargain with God based on how well you've kept the rules?
Or do you reject both of those corruptions and actively force yourself to remember the 12 and the 7 baskets? Do you recall the massive, undeniable history of God's grace to silence your present anxiety?
There might only be one loaf left in your boat today. The math of your situation might look genuinely terrifying. But the fundamental question you have to answer is not how much bread you have managed to secure. The only question that matters is, have you realized who is sitting next to it?